Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webcast on the wonderful book that's been written, An Intercultural Church from Multicultural World, Reflections on Gift Exchange by Bishop Martyn Snow and contributions by Bishop Lusa, Nsenga-Ngoy, Bishop Saju, Muthalaly, Jessie, Tang, and Florence Gidia. The aim of this evening is to open up a debate about this idea of gift exchange and looking at what it means to be an intercultural church in a multicultural community and how this may actually allow us to fully express together what it means to reflect the image of God. The wonderful thing about this book is its central theme of gift exchange. And what we hope to do tonight is for some of the contributors to reflect their ideas around gift exchange and what it might mean both pragmatically and theologically. You will note that in the YouTube notes, there is a link for the book itself. And if you were to purchase it, you would get a discount. So please do take note of it, and I'll mention it again later. It goes without saying that the main object of tonight is not just to listen, but for you to ask questions as well. So your comments and thoughts are welcome. So please feel free to send them. We've already received some of them, and we will be discussing them at the end of the contributions by each of our panelists. And then we also have 2 additional panelists who I'll tell you about later. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bishop Martyn Snow, who is the main author of this book. I'll just tell you a little bit about Bishop Martyn. He's been the Bishop of Leicester, and he's also previously been the Bishop of Tewkesbury from 2013 to 2016, and Archdeacon of Sheffield and Rotherham. He has a rich missional heritage from his parents and his grandparents, and an obvious love of diverse communities. Bishop Martyn, we welcome you and look forward to hearing a little bit about what inspired you to write this book.
Good evening, Sharon. Thank you for your welcome, and good evening to everybody. I'm really pleased you've been able to join us this evening. So, yes, an intercultural church for a multicultural world. In part, this was my sabbatical reflections on 7 years in Leicester, one of the most diverse cities in our country. So these are my reflections on what it means to be part of a diverse city, but also very much shared learning. So hence the invitation to various others to contribute to the book, because we've very much been in dialogue over recent years, learning about what it means to be a multicultural city. So where did I start? Well, it goes back into my past, as Sharon's already mentioned. I grew up with a love of different cultures, a love of wanting to understand more about people of different backgrounds. That's very much what shaped me as a person, and it was part of my sense of calling to come to Leicester. But I think the challenge that I realised early on in my time in Leicester was that for all that the community was very, very diverse, that wasn't really reflected within the life of our churches. So part of our journey over the last 7 years, in which others who've contributed to the book have all been part of, is a beginning of an exploration about what it means, not just to live alongside people of different cultures, but then to interact together. And it's that interaction which is the intercultural part of our journey. In other words, culture is not just living alongside each other, but genuinely engaging, genuinely learning from one another, and then using this exploration of gift exchange as a way into reflecting on all of that. The idea of gift exchange is one that's been with me for a long time. In fact, I tell a story in the book of an occasion in West Africa when I'd not been there very long. There was a knock on the door. A woman had come to see me with 3 of her children, 2 small children either side of her, and one strapped to her back in the typical African way. And in that part of West Africa, it's normal for greetings to take the form of a lot of questions. So one person asks the other person a lot of questions. They give set responses to those questions, and then they reverse roles. And only once all the questions have been asked and answered do you then begin a conversation. So this woman stood on my doorstep, asked me all the questions. Thankfully, my language had got to the point where I could just about give the answers to all the questions. And then I knew that I had to then ask her the questions. She gave me the answers. Unfortunately, that then was the limit of my knowledge of the language. So I did the only thing I could think of, which was to signal to her to come in, to enter into the living room, to take a seat. She did so with her children either side of her, taking her child off her back as well. And as she sat down, she launched into the greeting once again, all the same questions. I gave the responses, I asked her the questions and so on. And then we sat in silence. And of course, I'm wondering now, what am I supposed to do? Have I committed some terrible cultural faux pas in not offering her something? Or am I supposed to have somebody else in the room with me? I have no idea what I'm supposed to do and what the sort of cultural norms are in this particular society. Sensing my disease, I think, she then rises and as she straps her baby onto her back again, she greets me once more with all the same questions. I give the answers, I ask her the questions and so on. And then she makes her way to the door and she leaves. Well, as she leaves out the front door, I make a dash for the back door, down the back alley to go and find my language teacher to say, what was going on here? Have I committed some terrible cultural faux pas? Will people never speak to me again because I've been so rude? And I never forget the smile on his face as he reassured me and simply said, no, in our culture, it's normal when a new person arrives in the community to welcome them with a gift. My guess is, he said, that she was too poor to have anything to bring you. So she gave you something much more precious instead. She gave you the gift of her time. And it was that understanding of time as a gift which first triggered me to think about the different sorts of gifts that can be exchanged in society and the different ways in which they are exchanged in different cultures. There's actually a huge body of literature on this whole subject. It dates right the way back to ancient times. The Romans, the Greeks and so on, all did lots of studies on gift exchange, and right up to the modern day, all sorts of philosophers have explored it as well. So within the book, I give a brief summary of gift exchange, but then just begin, and it is no more than scratching the surface, to explore what happens when people of different cultures come together and see each other as a gift. So seeing the person as a gift before then seeing what particular qualities or gifts they may have to give to you as well. I think it not only unlocks a whole new approach to how people of different cultures interact, but it gets into the complexities of the power dynamics. Gift exchange is not always healthy. It can be done in a very oppressive way. So there's lots to reflect on, and hence the reason for writing the book. And I offer it to you as a gift. I'm very keen to hear from you this evening as to what you've made of this simple gift that I've been offering. So thank you, Sharon. Back to you.
Thank you, Bishop Martyn. We really look forward to delving into some of the rich, not ideas, but also the theology that's very much in the book later. So I'd like to encourage those that are watching, please do submit questions, comments, thoughts, and we will get around to them and share them and put them to Bishop Martyn later. Our next contributor is Bishop Saju Muthalaly. Now, Bishop Saju has been Bishop of Loughborough and also supporting Coventry as well in this period. So Bishop Saju describes himself as a lover of Jesus, which I think is just so apt, aren't we all, at the end of the day, which is wonderful. His family heritage is Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church, and he committed to his life to Christ as Jesus. So this is a very real and vibrant issue for him, to be amongst God's diverse people, having that heritage from a very long historical Christian tradition. Bishop Saju, we look forward to hearing what you have to say about gift and hospitality.
Sharon, thank you so much for your kindness in welcoming me. Good evening, everybody, or good morning, wherever you're joining. It's really good to see so many familiar names, and it'll be really good if you can just type your name and where you're from, so we know who you're speaking to as well, which is fantastic. Sharon, I'm going to start by talking about two things that have happened in the last 3 days, because I'm continually learning so much about hospitality and the relationship between hospitality and gift exchange. So yesterday, for the first time in my life, I went to Walsingham. Now, it is not my tradition in any way, shape or form, but the reason I was in Walsingham was because the fastest growing church in Leicester Diocese is in the heart of Leicester. And a significant number of people who are part of the church come from the southwest coast of India, the state of Kerala in India, where I was born. And there were a significant number of them who were going to Walsingham for the first time. So I just thought, listen, if being a bishop is being among your people, might as well be among your people. So I spent the day with them. There was 2.5 hours journey from Leicester to Walsingham and 2.5 hours back. And I was really curious as to what's going on in people's lives. People were tired of the journey of being new in England. And one of the things they said to me as to why they're part of the church is because they've experienced a profound sense of belonging. And the way in which they have experienced belonging is by the conduit of hospitality. Hospitality in the sense of they were able to eat around the table. That is both sacramental, but also tables in the life of the church. But also that sense of belonging that comes from being appreciated of the gifts that people bring. So hospitality is not just receivers of hospitality, but also as givers of hospitality. I think people yesterday articulated that in so many ways. And that I found so moving, the table, the hospitality as the conduit in which we find meaningful relationships and identity and purpose and storytelling, which is so, so powerful. So that was yesterday, that profound sense of belonging that comes from a place of giving and receiving, being host and being guest. On Saturday afternoon, I was speaking to 3,500 St. Thomas Christians who live in Britain. So the vast majority of them are working in either software industry or in NHS, a significant number of them. And the reason is they're called St. Thomas Christians is because the fundamental conviction they carry is that St. Thomas, the man who doubted Jesus, went to the west coast of India in 52 AD, in the 1st century. That is the conviction of the church. The reality for the Christians, St. Thomas Christians in Kerala, is this: somebody opened the door for them. Somebody practiced hospitality for St. Thomas. And therefore, hospitality becomes in so many ways the bedrock of St. Thomas Christians. And I was telling them, listen, you are world class at it. And therefore, the reality of having experienced our own story within the story of St. Thomas, who experienced hospitality. This is not just for St. Thomas Christians. This is the reality of every church in the East and in the West. The church is what it is because of the hospitality of people. The gospel comes with a house key, someone said. So therefore, hospitality is the conduit in which the world will hear the mission of Jesus. So my argument is every one of us have heard about Christ because somebody showed and experienced hospitality. And therefore, my chapter in the book, which is in the middle of the book, is all about hospitality as the sense of a place in which people can experience the remarkable gift of faith, hope, and love. And I suppose when I say hospitality, there's my last thought, is hospitality as sharing food. There's something extraordinary that happens. But hospitality is also as a spirit. As soon as I walk into the door of any of your church or your schools or your chaplain, I will, before too long, know whether this place has an embodied hospitable spirit or not. And therefore, the capacity of leadership to be able to not just practice hospitality, but also cultivating and nurturing a hospitable spirit, which is something that every one of us, whether we are a child, a young person, or perhaps somebody who has been older and have been walking with Jesus we all can practice hospitality. And somehow it seems to me, Sharon, that Jesus is made known in the breaking of the bread. And that is a prophetic truth for all of history. It seems to me also, as we exercise hopeful imagination for the future, that Jesus is made known in the breaking of the bread. That is both sacramental, but also on our kitchen tables. May hospitality be the conduit in which life in all its fullness, abundant life, be made known to the corners of the world. And so therefore, eat away, people. That's exactly what I want to say in the book. Eat away. Back to you, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Bishop Saju. I love that idea of eating away, this sort of exuberance at the feast, how we do that with one another. And I'd love to unpack that with you later. Our next contributor is Jessie, Tang. Now, Jessie is the Intercultural Ministry Director.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm afraid it seems like Sharon might be frozen, so I will start with my presentation now. So I'm going to start by just echoing something that I have heard recently. And it goes like this. Baby looks like me. Baby looks like me. This was the cry of an African Caribbean child as she ran towards a black doll at a parent-toddler group in church. One of our churches in the Diocese of Leicester is situated in a relatively rural area. And at that time, the church decided to diversify their resources, even though there wasn't any global majority heritage people in the congregation. But they understood that the gospel is for all nations, and they understood that the landscape would be changing. And this foster child would pick up this doll every time she came to the parent-toddler group, and she would not put it down. She saw herself in that gesture. I think this is the importance of representation, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. It shows that someone is not alone. It shows someone the possibilities of who someone can be and what someone can do as well. And as well as communicating belonging, I think representation also declares that you have a gift to bring. So I am someone who is second generation immigrant. I was born and brought up in this country, but unfortunately, I rarely saw examples of myself in media or politics or the church, unless I went to a Chinese church, and also in leadership positions in society. What about you? Do you see images of yourself at church? And are the stained glass windows of people from your heritage In the Lord's Prayer and in the spoken liturgy, do you hear your native language? What about the songs and hymns sung? Are they in a style and language that is familiar to you? Everything from the people who you see at front, to the songs that we sing at church, to the food and the refreshments after a service, has the possibility of communicating who belongs, who is excluded, and who the gospel is for. And if we truly believe that God is the God of all nations, then I think we need to start acting that way. Now, when we are looking to change what is the norm, we might accidentally fall into tokenism. For example, if you ask me to pray in Mandarin, my guess is, oh, maybe you don't really know me because I speak Cantonese at home and I can read a bit of Mandarin, but I don't really know what it means. And I actually usually pray in English. So relationship is important to avoid tokenism and truly work towards representation, to actually know the cry of the hearts of the people around you and to invite one another to bring their gift. In the afterword of this book, I talk about the burden of gift giving when I don't know my culture. And if Intercultural Church is a place where the good of the cultures and the gifts of the people are brought to shape the culture of the church, then what happens when I don't know mine? I think this is not a question just for second generation immigrants, but many others also have to learn to appreciate their culture. We actually have to go on a journey of learning and unlearning because due to racism, colonial history, and the dominance of Western Christendom, we can't see sometimes that our cultures are a gift to be brought for the blessing of the body. Instead, what is sometimes communicated is that the body is white British, and that's the way it's always been, and that's enough, right? So what I'm saying is I'm looking for two things. Firstly, to help those who are in the margins, those who are of global majority heritage, to see that within ourselves, we actually do have a gift to bring. And secondly, what I'm looking for is a healthy church culture that actually says we need each other, where all can flourish in the good of their cultures and gifts. Something that impedes this cultivation of healthy culture like this is resistance. And I've written a little bit about it in the afterword as well. But we have to recognize that there are different people on different parts of the journey when it comes to intercultural ministry, and that some people in our congregations will be opposed to it. Some who have always been in leadership positions or hold an important seat at the table aren't always willing to step aside and be led by those unlike us. So how then can we grow as intercultural communities when only one culture gets to make the decisions? I think it's vulnerable to bring of yourself, especially when it's rejected or discriminated against. I think it's vulnerable also to take up space when we're not used to it and was never allowed to do so. So I hope that this is a challenge for us to intentionally strive to have a culture of mutuality, which says we need one another, a culture of curiosity, and a culture of love as well. And the last thing I would say is to get to know one another, to get to know people, to learn what each other's stories are, and allow each other to know that we all have a gift to bring, and to bring our gifts whilst also stepping aside for the gifts of others. Thank you so much. And I'm going to hand back to Sharon now. Hopefully she's unfrozen.
Hi, Jessie. Thank you so much. Yes, I didn't get to introduce you, so I feel very much that I'd like to just say that you are an ethnomusicologist by background and director. I always want to get this completely right because I manage to always get this wrong. Just to say that you're the Intercultural Ministry Director for the Diocese of Leicester. Thanks so much, Jessie. We will explore some of those things that you've highlighted because I think they're so key to having an honest, courageous conversation about what it means to be an intercultural church. We'll do that later. Our next speaker is Bishop Lusa Nsenga-Ngoy from Willesden. And Bishop Lusa has been there since 2022 and describes himself in this way. that he is passionate about seeing all people flourish and for them to embody the aspiration of the beloved community. The community that has the capacity to enable the kind of storytelling that invites us all to discover the wilds beyond our fences and recover belonging. Bishop Lusa.
Sharon, thank you, and greetings, friends. What a delight, what a feast we're being given to partake into. Allow me to share a few thoughts. One, starting with a memory of my teenage years, early teenage years, as I remember words of the lyrics of a song. I think it was Joan Osborne who was asking, what if God was one of us? And somehow hinting that God might be just a lost being trying to find his way home. And home, in many ways, being the longing of most of our lives, even those of us who have lived a relatively nomadic experience. There is always a sense in which we want to find a place of location, connection, and belonging. That's the deepest longing of human experience and human identity. And in fact, we come into the world literally attached, connected, tethered to another human being, perhaps highlighting something of the fact that being human, partaking in the experience of being human, is about living life where we are not just connected, but we are also claimed by those with whom we do life. And living in a multicultural space is a space that is often shaped and fragmented around a series of polarities, of fragmentations that often set us at odds with one another. And even in those spaces of tension, of fragmentation, and distance, and sometimes exclusion, there are experiences of embrace. There are experiences of connection that often highlight something of our shared human identity, of our shared human story. The church is the primary location, I think, where that experience has been availed to me. And I've had the blessing of living in a variety of countries, born in the Congo, grew up partly in the Congo and Central African Republic, then moved to Belgium. And for the past couple of decades, I've now lived in Britain. And in all of those contexts, there's been always a quest and a longing to find a place of not just connection, but a place where I was deeply claimed, a place where I could belong. And I recently came across the words of the Egyptian poet Naguib Mahfouz, who says that home is not where one was born, but it's where all our attempts to escape cease. And I love just the poetic way in which he puts that. And yet there is a sense in which in some of those places we find ourselves, all attempts to escape seem frustrated by a constant narrative that reminds us of our otherness, reminds us of our strangeness, and often compels us to inhabit the margins of the spaces we are drawn into, rather than flourish at the heart of it. Looking back at my life of peregrination, I remember particularly a time in Belgium as we had arrived in the 80s, late 80s, with as children, following parents who had relocated from Congo to Belgium, and locating ourselves within a Christian community. And I remember quite distinctively the generosity, or at least what I perceived at the time as expressions of generosity, of people who would occasionally come and bring us either furniture or items of clothing, shoes, and so on. Only later on to revisit that chapter of my life and recognize that what we were given was not actually the fruit of abundant generosity, but was rather the discarded gift or discarded possessions that some of our fellow Christians weren't needing any longer, but wanted to, probably didn't quite contemplate discarding, and therefore we're passing them on to us and giving to us the responsibility of owning something that was not quite as cherished by them any longer. And to me, that highlights something of the tension around the dynamic of giving, where the gift often happens in spaces where there isn't equality or equivalence in the one giving and the one receiving, where there is an implicit tension, an asymmetry in the position that we inhabit and occupy in the exchange. That has manifested as well in some of our political and global narratives, where historically we've been through processes of trying to deconstruct and decolonize some of the spaces that we inhabit, and recognizing that some of the dynamics and the context and the relationship that have existed between us, the tethering that has held us together, were often predicated on complex narrative, complex relationships, tensions in which the value of the other was treated as less honorable, less worthy of the ultimate expression of our generosity towards the other. Saju, Bishop Saju was talking earlier about the hospitality and the gift of the gospel, which emanates from a desire and a commitment to bridge the gaps that separate our humanity. There is, even at the heart of that dynamic, sometimes the complex reality of a gospel that is framed into so narrow normative cultural expressions that ultimately it deprives the other of the essence of their story, the essence of their identity, and therefore calls us and ties us into narratives in which we are caught up into spaces where the story we share and the story that shape our shared spaces are emptied of the potential of mutual flourishing or mutual enrichment. This book that we are privileged to be able to expand on, in many ways invite us to try and rethink and reset some of those normative narratives that often squeeze us into spaces where all our attempts to escape are frustrated, spaces where we can't quite find home, and spaces where the quest becomes even more urgent than when we first started. But it is an invitation, an opportunity for us to try and reset and reframe those dynamics and rethink and reconsider our particular location in our relationship with the other in ways that bring not just the best of ourselves as a gift to the other, but in a way that helps the other flourish as a result of us interacting with one another and availing ourselves into a space of mutuality and exchange. Gift giving as storytelling that expands our sense of self, but that also leads us into a place where we are connected, we are claimed, and we find home, that place where all attempts to escape cease. Back to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Bishop Lusa. And thank you for that really rich exploration and starting to unpack some of the complex nuances of what it means to be a diverse church together, and also the realities of living with one another as well. Before I open up the conversation to the panelists, I just would like to introduce two other members of the panelists who are with us tonight and who might want to share their reflections. The first one is Anjali Kanagaratnam. Sorry, my throat is really bothering me today. Kanagaratnam. And Anjali, please tell me if I mispronounce names, because names are important. And Richard Sudworth. And I'd invite you to give your comments and reflections before we open up the questions.
Maybe I'll start with just a few reflections as I reflect on my own journey in the 4 decades or so as a lay and then recently an ordained person. And the Church of England for me has been a place of sincere welcome and belonging. And I think it's fair to say that every church wants to be a place of welcome and belonging. But one of the things that I realized as I journeyed was that in the church, as in the rest of society, this can be conditional. When we are in any way different or other, this welcome and belonging can be dependent on the extent to which we fit into an existing ideas of what is good or what is right or what is proper. And it's often the case that we're valued more if we can fit into the dominant culture. So I find the metaphor of gift exchange really helpful in helping us think about what it means to be church in the 21st century multicultural Britain. A church that, to put it bluntly, is fit for purpose. The metaphor is so rich, but I just want to draw on a couple of points that really resonated with me. And first is the concept of gift itself, because intrinsic to genuine gift giving is the idea of value and worth. And so it emphasized the idea that each and every member of the church is a gift and so needs to be valued. And just as we don't want all gifts to be the same, we need to value the gift of each and every person with all the uniqueness and different beauty that they bring. And secondly, the idea of exchange reminds us of the importance of reciprocity, of giving and receiving, because I think as Christians, we are good at giving. But this is a reminder that we also need to receive in a posture of humility and openness, even when we think that the gift that is being given is different from what we may be used to or what we think we need. But of course, I think this isn't just about welcome and belonging. It is also about, and I would end with a quote from theologian Miroslav Volf, keeping our allegiance to Jesus Christ pure by listening to the voice of Christians from other cultures, so as to make sure that the voice of our culture has not drowned out the voice of Jesus Christ. Thank you. Back to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Anjali. Richard.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so much wisdom being shared and a really compelling vision of why we should see each other. And speaking as a white priest in the Church of England, particularly that responsibility to see the gift bearer and the other cultures that are around us in the church and beyond into wider society. I'm reminded, and there are threads coming through of the grit in this, because whilst there's this compelling vision, we've been hearing from each of the speakers of actually the hard work and intention that's required here. I'm reminded of a quote from, and this shows my age, a Liverpool footballer in the 1980s who had a disastrous year when he transferred from Liverpool to an Italian club. And he said, it was really difficult. It was like being abroad. And to some extent, we face a task, all of us, and particularly those of us who are white leaders in the church, of recognizing that we are in a place of difference and have to make spaces, have to see the gift and the other, and that sometimes that will mean some of us stepping aside from certain roles, but also, and hearing Jessie talk a little bit around just the hard work of not avoiding the tokenism, which requires relationship. What's really going on with different members of our congregation, with different parts of the church, wider church that we might be a part of? So there's a real task of listening, because we can kind of have our superficial judgments and presumptions, and there's so much complexity across our cultures and across generations these days. But that itself is an opportunity for gift, because when you encounter difference, much like with the analogy that I know has come up in the questions in the chat and with the quip from Ian Rush, it's only when we encounter the other truly that we can discover ourselves fully, and each of us become mutual gift bearers. And just to finish on that other bit of grit that Lusa was touching on, and Saju talked of hospitality. Again, for those of us who are Anglicans, and I'm conscious not everyone on this webinar is Anglican, but particularly those of us in the Church of England, we've got a big thing about being hospitable. You know, we love hosting. That's the kind of natural disposition, but that can be weaponized. That can be patronizing. That can be superficial. So sometimes how can our hosting push us to be intentionally a guest? To say, well, actually, I'm going to sit at the feet. I'm going to go and listen to. I'm going to give away this cultural expression in worship, this language expression in reading or in prayer. So there's this, what I think is a Christian model of hospitality, where we model being host and guest, but there's so much here and so much grit that, again, it's touched on in the chat around the hard work and intention, but also the joy in that process that gives us more than we could ever imagine.
Oh, thank you, Richard, for those thoughts. There's been a lot of questions in the chat, and we're going to try and share that with the panel. But I just want to acknowledge the range of places people are tuning in to this webcast from. We've got people from Canada, as well as from Australia, as well as mainland Britain as well, Great Britain. So thank you all. And what has been said by one of our contributors, not everybody is from an Anglican background, but we are the church, and we are the church that is striving together to reflect the image of God in all God's fullness in creation. So this is the time where I'm going to identify a few questions. I'm going to go back to Bishop Martyn. I don't know whether all the panelists are going to come up or we're going to see individual panelists, but Bishop Martyn, if I can start with you and this idea of this radical receptivity that you refer to in terms of gift exchange. You could unpack that a bit more. But what does that mean in actuality?
Thank you, Sharon. That's a great question, and yes, picks up on one of the three characteristics, if you like, that I try to develop within the book around generous giving, radical receptivity, and transformative thanksgiving. So the radical receptivity, I think, is starting from that understanding that all of us assume our own culture is normative. But because culture is, if you like, the air that we breathe, it's just our normal way of operating. So we assume that everybody behaves in the way that we do or does things in the same way that we do. And it's only when we travel to a different part of the world, or when we meet people in our own society who've come from a different part of the world, that we suddenly wake up to the fact that actually our own way of doing things is not the only way. There are other ways that are very different. So that the radical receptivity, I suppose, is connected then to a cultural humility, that growth of understanding that just because I think my culture is normal does not mean it's the best. And for white Westerners like me, that is a hugely significant thing because of our history. And we have to acknowledge that so much of our history of the last 300 or so years, at least, has been based on this assumption that white Western culture is normative for the world. And we embarked on this program of trying to civilize the rest of the world, which was just code for making the rest of the world like us. So the radical receptivity is about how we then receive from other cultures. Recognizing our own is not normative for everybody, is not necessarily the best. So how do we receive from others? And it is a radical process, I think, of decentering ourselves. So actually starting to look to others' interests rather than our own. Philippians 2 speaks to that very, very clearly. There's lots more I could say around it, but I think I owe a debt actually to the writer Al Barrett, some of you may have come across, who has developed this idea of radical receptivity, particularly actually in his case in relation to what might be called sort of working class cultures, those cultures which are not used to sort of academic study and so on. But I think it actually is applicable to lots of different cultures actually, and at its heart, as I say, is about decentering our own culture.
Thank you, Bishop Martyn. We've got a question here from Eileen, and I just want to acknowledge that because it was sent in quite early on isn't this something that we do naturally anyway? It's a sort of intercultural posture that we take. Isn't it a natural and normal experience as people choose to go on holiday in places with different cultures and to engage with different cultures? How might we use this to shape the intercultural experience as a church? I'm going to open that question up to Bishop Saju.
Okay, Sharon, I think if I am going on a holiday this summer, I am coming from a very different place to the vast majority of the world who perhaps cannot go on a holiday. So this year, I am going on a holiday. We're going all the way. We're flying, 6 of us in our family, all the way to Cyprus. What can I do in that context? Well, the first thing I can do is embody humility. I don't know everything. In fact, I want to be able to learn. That is something I can embody on my travels. Perhaps I wonder if there is also a place for asking genuine questions in the spirit of praying in a place with a posture of genuine learning. What is it I can learn about God even on a short journey with my family? So there's something there, it seems to me, Sharon, around kind of, embodying cultural humility. And I just love that expression of radical receptivity. What is it that I can embrace and learn on the way, even on a holiday, as it were? So that's my starting point, perhaps even this summer applicable. Don't go presuming that you know, go with a sense of hunger to learn and to see people in the light of Christ.
Several of you, thank you so much. Several of you have touched on this tension and the challenge and the burden of gift giving. And one of the questions that we've received from our audience is around this need to reflect on repentance, this need for repentance, which is at the core of having a posture of humility. And I wondered if you could talk to that in either a pragmatical way, of what it looks like in your various contexts, or theologically. So I'm going to go to Jessie, because you talked about the burden of gift giving. And so when we acknowledge this burden, what does a repentant, humble posture look like?
Thank you so much, Sharon. Yes, I think that in building intercultural church and ministry, we do need to think about humility. And I think that a way that we can address talking about repentance is actually through communication, because if we don't communicate that actually there is something that needs to be repented of, then how can we get to the place of repentance? So I think honest communication is very important for this. But also I was at a conference recently and somebody talked about public repentance. And actually, I wonder if in any of our churches, does somebody come to the front and publicly repent about something? For example, a particular issue that might have come up in the news, is that addressed in the church? And are we talking about some of these issues that affect people who are in the margins or not coming from the dominant culture? And actually, can we address that collectively to help others to see that actually we are a body which is not just looking inside, but looking outside as well? And so be places of repentance and reconciliation in that way.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jessie. If I could take a slightly different tact now and looking at, so we often talk about intercultural church and this idea that we are a gift to one another and this idea of gift exchange, but we know that it can be problematic, and you alluded to that in your contribution, Bishop Martyn and Bishop Lusa, the tensions, the inherent tensions, but also the inequity of burden, and again, touching on this very slightly. So how can we as a people of God embody and embrace a theology? What comes to your mind when theologically, when we're talking and thinking through the realities of these tensions that Richard alluded to, Anjali alluded to? How can we speak into that theologically?
Shall I make a start on that, and others can then contribute as well? So, just briefly to say, a wonderful book, Paul Barclay, on Paul and the idea of gift. In which he makes the very simple point that actually in Greek, the word for gift and the word for grace are the same word. So, whenever in the Bible you read the word grace, it could just as easily be translated as gift. And I think there's a really rich theme to mine, if you like, throughout the New Testament in exploring the interchangeability of those two words. And in particular, I suppose, the understanding, therefore, that there is a need for great grace. So Paul himself had his offer of gift to others rejected at times. And there's something about how did he respond to the rejection of himself and the rejection of the gift that he was offering. He made a point of trying to gather up gifts in terms of money from one community to take to another community. But in various places in the New Testament, we get it unpacked in terms of the complexities of that and all that meant in terms of the relationship between the different communities. So a simple idea, but one for further study, definitely, about the interchangeability of gift and grace.
Bishop Lusa, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, well, thank you, Martyn, for this. And I think that there is something when we talk about gift and grace, particularly in Poland language, of the centrality of the definition of God as the chief giver, but also an invitation for us, also in our imitation of Christ, of God, to become participants in that movement of gift giving. It seems to me that there is something, particularly when we want to address the tension, the fracture, to recognize that a normative story as humanity is one that is defined by fracture, is one that is defined by separation and exclusion. And so our default movement is one that will be predicated by a desire to classify and to distinguish, and often in a way that objectifies and commodifies. And often what it does also, it leads groups that are at odds with each other, or individuals that are at odds with each other, to use a more transactional pathway to try and create some sort of rapprochement. And I guess the challenge of the gospel, the challenge of scripture, is to take us beyond the transactional, because the transactional ultimately is not one that is wholly costly to all of us, because it will be determined by our capacity to determine how far we want to go into that transactional dynamic. But instead, relational capital is where we invited into. And the essence and the heart of our faith is to respond to a generous God, not in a transactional way, but in a relational way. And so for me, part of the test really is how willing are we to invest in the relational, that dynamic that does not highlight either a deficit or excess in our particular locations, but that compels us to enter into a space where indeed the playing field is leveled, and where we encounter one another in a way that enables us to rename the other not as a stranger, but as a sister, as a brother, as a sibling in faith, and to be named not just as a stranger, but as a sibling.
Thank you. There is something about relational ways of being that opens up the conversation to a level where it goes past the superficial and it's much deeper, and therefore we are mutually vulnerable. And so, I mean, I sort of say all that because we have lots of comments, and folks, I'll try and get around to as many as I can do. But one comment which probably crystallizes a few others is, why are we still having these discussions? Why are we still having these discussions? Are these new discussions? Are these discussions necessary? And I don't think that's meant in a way to negate the aim of the book, but it's saying, so how do we have these discussions if they're needed? Why are they needed in the first place, which is what we've been talking about. But I just wondered, would our panelists like to speak to those comments around the need for these discussions?
Sharon, I'm happy to start on this, particularly because what I've been learning, particularly from an Indian economist by the name of Amartya Sen. And I think it addresses the question of why we are having this conversation. Amartya Sen argues when it comes to understanding another worldview, another culture, there are three different broad categories in how we encounter another culture. The first one, he argues, is an exotic one, whereby we look at another culture with a sense of what is different about that culture, and therefore trying to understand it in a very academic sense, to see what is different about that. And it is still a very cerebral kind of process. That's the exotic one. The second thing he argues says there's another way of looking at it, which is not exotic, but it is a magisterial. So the word British Raj comes to mind. People's understanding of India, for instance, is actually an ancient understanding, which is mired with nostalgia and the good old days of the British Raj. And in that sense, it's both exotic, but also dynamics of power come into play where some people are more important than the others. So the second reason. The third is the one that is fascinating, Sharon, which is why I think I'm interested in this. Amartya Sen says, how about embracing a much more curatorial understanding, which is, I think, really interesting. I'm not sure if he had the theological understanding of what the word curatorial, but actually is where we get the word, I think, curacy. How do we cure? How do we culture and curate a space whereby curing can take place, healing can take place? I think the reason I think intercultural gift exchange is important is because it is the space for healing and restoration, and that is deeply theological. For me, it being a place where healing and curing can take place over a long period of time is the insight that Amartya Sen brings into it. That's why it's important to me, because healing is possible, repentance is possible, restoration is possible, God's church, ecclesia, gathering of people from every nation and tribe is possible. And I genuinely believe in that vision. That's why it's important, it seems to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. there's been some suggestions that we have this conversation on a regular basis as part of our PCCs and various ways of being church together. Richard.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, I mean, I think I'd make the observation we're still needing to have this conversation, because many of the cultures in our churches are not flourishing in ways that they can and ought to be, because of really not grappling and embracing that sense of gift exchange and mutual hospitality. And I'll cite one very recent example. So Sharon mentioned a PCC. So that's, for those that are not Church of England, that's the kind of church leadership structure at the local congregational level. So a church I know with an aim to be multicultural in a multicultural area, inadvertently, without intention, suddenly realised that their just agreed new PCC, Council of the Church, is completely white. And they got to the meeting with everyone's kind of standing in these positions without having thought through and gone, right, how do we need to reflect the diversity of this congregation? And it's because we're still, in many of us, with the levers of power in the church, are not being intentional about how we receive the gift of the other. We still need to be talking about this.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you. Anjali, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'm going to come in from a very different tack and just talk about my personal story, which is that having been in the church for a very long time and loving the Church of England, it is still very difficult to be authentic, because space isn't made for people who are different. That space. And so I think it's really important, if we want our churches to be places of belonging. And I think it's really good that we're moving towards having motions on PCC, but we've got to be really careful that they don't become tokenistic. And so I think gift exchange, or another metaphor is embrace, they help us to think much more deeply than just having a person who looks different falling within the dominant cultural norm. So I think we need to have this discussion so we can move beyond tokenism to real exchange and really learning from each other and actually wanting the other in our dominant spaces.
Thank you so much. A question that's just come in: are intercultural churches better able to evangelize other faith groups? That's a big question there. Any thoughts on that?
May I offer some thoughts?
Yes, please.
If evangelism is the task of channeling and offering good news to the world, then there is something about the church that is not qualified. So the church, in its essence, in its vocation, to be that channel of God's grace to the world, that then means that such a church should be open and able to reach out the wide openings of our world. But there is also something about a church that is intentionally intercultural, that recognizes that ultimately its identity, its shape, its posture is not one that is rigidly set within culturally normative space, but it is one that is constantly morphing and growing and developing, and one that is open to expressing its understanding of God and developing a sophisticated and rich way of speaking God that becomes consonant with a global expression of that. So if our pursuit is primarily to shape a church that is culturally narrow, therefore it becomes a much arduous task to try and avail that good news in a way that becomes pertinent and consonant to others. And indeed, the nature of the early church itself was confronted with the tension of determining whether it was going to be either a Jewish movement or a gentle one, and decided actually for an alternative route, which was to be a third way, where both the gift of the Jewish identity and the Gentile expression would coexist together. And that church became the one capable of being translated in ways that became pertinent to the various contexts in which it entered. And so therefore, a church that is intercultural is a church that has got a fluidity in translating the identity and the nature and the story of Christ in ways that become adaptable and acceptable and integrated in any culture, any context, any language.
Yeah, absolutely. Which brings me to the point, and I'm going to go back to Bishop Martyn, because there's something very important about relationality, isn't there? In terms of a gift exchange, although the gift exchange, as you point out in the book, can be framed in very different ways. Time, not just material resource, the gift of ourselves, friendship. However, the perceptions around either the receipt of that gift or the giving of that gift can vary culturally. What are the insights you can give in terms of having that deeper conversation, which kind of circumvents some of that misunderstanding that a couple of our audience have alluded to, that can happen when there is an attempt to be mutually reciprocal in terms of gifting?
Thank you, Sharon. It's a fascinating question, and in the book, I refer to a time when I was vicar of a local church, and we had up on the notice board the simple slogan, "It's all about relationships." And I was sort of unsure about this to begin with, thinking, surely it should be a Bible verse, or surely it should be something, which speaks directly about Jesus. But it was extraordinary, the number of comments and conversations that this simple slogan led to. It's all about relationship. And it is, in a sense, that simple. I do think what we are talking about here is about genuine relationships where we see the other as a gift to us, whoever they are, whatever their background, whatever they have or haven't done in life, just simply receiving them as a gift. But a gift that in a sense, I suppose, has to be unpacked and unwrapped. And there's a sense in which actually in our dialogue and in our interaction with each other, we are sort of unwrapping that gift, if you like, and discovering more and more of the richness of it. And again, in the book, I explore that in relation to intercultural theology. So I think there's something very interesting about the way we have started, and it has been a very recent thing, really. We've started to understand that people of different cultures actually approach the task of theology in very different ways. So again, it's back to the sort of, Western normativity, where we assume that, all theology has been done in either English or German universities or, American universities or whatever. And we completely ignore the richness of theology around the world. The reality, of course, is it's done in a very different way. So Saju won't mind saying at all that one of the things I greatly enjoy about working closely with Bishop Saju is his love of telling stories. That's the way I think that he does his theology. He tells stories about his encounters with different people, or about his reflections on different events that he's been to, and so on. And I love that. It's a different way of doing theology, if you like, to the one in which I was trained, but actually is extraordinarily rich. So there's something about how do we open ourselves to different approaches to theology, different approaches to dialogue. There's so many different possibilities within all of that, but it comes down to relationship being the absolute key.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the words that's being used quite a bit in terms of, I'm going to mention the R word, reconciliation, and that in itself needs a lot of unpacking, is curiosity. And so how do we keep that kind of spirit of curiosity? I think somebody talked about a curiosity of wanting to engage with another, a spirit of wanting to do that with another. And I'm going to come back to Richard, because I don't feel we've quite finished talking about the working with others from different faiths. And I just wondered this idea of curiosity, because often as churches, we're located within particular contexts, which is not just about the individuals within that church, but a diverse range of people outside of that church as well. So I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, without wanting to sort of add a huge complication to this one, and I don't think it is. It's really offering another theological underpinning. I mean, I love the word curiosity, but another word that might be appropriate here as we think of all people around us is wonder, W-O-N-D-E-R. And part of this principle of gift exchange is the recognition that everyone is made in the image of God. And therefore, anyone, whether they are a Christian, atheist, Sikh, Hindu, Muslim, Jew, I have the possibility of encountering something of God as I meet them. Now, there is something definitive about the Christian family connection, because there's the guaranteed presence of the Holy Spirit within the ecclesia, within the church, where we need to expect that gift of God amongst ourselves. But there's the wonder and the curiosity beyond the church of what is it in my neighbour that can challenge me, that can be a gift to me, that's also part of a similar move. And so when we're trying to struggle with these various metaphors of what hospitality is and receptivity and gift exchange, ultimately this is about how we meet God and meeting God within the church, within our family, but the possibility with the echoes of everyone who's made in the image of God, where we can encounter some grace even beyond the church. I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. So it reminds me of something that I read in the book, which Bishop Saju wrote about. It's Sanskrit, and it's about hospitality in relation to another, as in respect of, is it serving God's own reflection? I can't remember the exact phrase you used in relation to
Atiti Devo Bhava, which is a Sanskrit expression where the stranger, yes, it's the gift of seeing the image of God in the stranger.
Absolutely. Irrespective of who that individual is, that we are continually, intentionally looking to see that and joining in with what God is doing, isn't it? In that respect as well. That's great. Anjali, if I can come to you, you said something quite profound that really struck me, which is around, us, reflecting Christ in our relationships and our connections with people, but understanding that as intrinsically part of our identity. I wondered if you'd like to unpack that a bit more.
So, sorry, let me just clarify that, Sharon. So reflecting the image of
God, yeah,
Christ
yeah,
in the differences we have.
yeah.
I think, the idea that all humans are made in the image of God immediately says that everyone, whether you are of the normative culture or otherwise, reflects something of that image. And I think when the church emphasizes a dominant culture, we only see part of that image reflected. And I've had the privilege of living in Sri Lanka, where I was born, but also in Thailand. And I've seen the way in which people act differently, think differently, behave differently, and theologize differently, worship differently. And we see aspects of God's image in a very different way. And I think so, as a church, when we draw on the understanding that others have of Christ, when we listen to those voices whose minds have been shaped by other cultures, whose reading of the Bible has been shaped by other cultures, we get a much better idea of who God is, which is why I think, I'm so passionate about intercultural church and listening to each other as we do church, as we live as Christians.
Yeah. I think, Bishop Martyn, you said this at the beginning, that actually theology, we do this together, that actually there's something that comes out of the way that we interact, the way that we think and reflect theologically together, which we would not necessarily have if we do that individually. How do we start to create those spaces and places for that to happen when we are often constrained by our traditional ways of being? And what I mean by that is, and this is not to reject our liturgical ways of being and our frameworks, but they can be very formalized and very specific. So how do we start to introduce elements of the richness found amongst God's people?
I'm wondering if Jessie might like to say a bit on this, because she's had some really creative ideas around intercultural worship and the use of liturgy and so on within that. I think I'd want to say I think there's a number of levels to it, though. So as I say, I'll leave Jessie to sort of talk about the liturgical and worship side of things. But I'm very conscious that when we try and engage theologically, as in a sort of dialogue between people of different cultures and different approaches to theology, it can get really, really challenging and really, really difficult. And I think it was the point Richard made a little bit earlier on about, this can sound quite intriguing or just interesting on a sort of theoretical level. Living it out in real life, in our churches, in our communities, does get really messy and really, really hard. So I think I just want to acknowledge that, and acknowledge that any church, any individual that wants to go on this intercultural journey has to be ready to be deeply challenged, and for that even to be quite painful in the midst of it all. But let me stop there. And I don't know, Jessie, do you want to comment on the sort of liturgical side of things?
Sure. Thank you so much. I've got a lot of ideas now, but I think one thing I'd say is, if we want to build intercultural communities through worship, is that it's something that is not just for church musicians and those who are involved in the music to think about, but it has to be a shared goal, a shared vision with the leadership of the church as well. But one of the ways of increasing, I guess, visibility and thinking about intercultural worship, a way of introducing it is to think about, actually, when we are praying for particular situations or countries in the world, can we also sing a song from that nation? What are the songs of the people? Can we sing or listen to a song from that nation as we are praying along for that country or news or situation at the moment? Other ways is something I like to call a bring and share. So often we talk about bring and share when we are bringing food from our cultures, But what about bring and share song or bring and share something from your culture? So it's a way of getting to know one another in a deeper level, but also being able to share something that's from our cultures, which could actually shape the way that we do church or the way that we worship on a Sunday.
That's great. It sounds like you've got lots of ideas, Jessie, as well, that will obviously be part of an ongoing conversation, because this isn't just a one-off conversation. What we hope is that this conversation will keep going on and getting richer, like a rich tapestry of various perspectives that are interwoven. I want to come to the whole idea of storytelling and reframing our story, as Bishop Lusa writes in the foreword. Reframing our collective stories. Bishop Martyn's alluded to how messy this can be. And we know that how we tell each other our stories isn't just framed in one particular way or framework. It's actually in lots of different ways. So, Bishop Lusa, I know that you're very interested in storytelling, and could you give us an insight into how do we start to honestly engage with each other's stories?
Well, thank you. I grew up as a child having fond memories of evenings spent around the fire, hearing some of our elders telling us stories. And the notion that emerged out of the stories was one that they were educative. They gave us a sense of how to name the birds, the plants, and the animals that surrounded us. There were stories that also socialized us into our people's genesis. But they were a story that weren't simply turned towards the past, but they were essentially open towards the future. And there is a sense in my culture and tradition that we are defined by the stories that we tell of ourselves and the stories that we hear of ourselves. There is therefore the imperative to develop communities that gather around storytellers. And we may all be familiar with the griot of West Africa, and in fact across most African cultures, whose task is not simply to entertain the community, but it's to mobilize the community, to enlist the community into a participative task of help shaping the story. So while the story may be known, there's always a sense in which every member of the gathering is invited not simply to be a spectator, but an actor in telling the story, either in joining in with the call and responses, or in inviting the griot to steer the story in a different direction. So it seems to me that if we truly are a people that is gathered around a particular story, which is the epic story of God's love in Jesus, there is something about stimulating the voices of storytellers around us who will help mobilize us and enlist us in the task of not just retelling that story, but reliving that story. And we do so in our liturgy, in fact. And there's that real opportunity to gather around a shared story, but also compel ourselves to enter the stories, not just as entertainment or as a looking back, but as a commitment towards the future, God's future, that promises reconciliation and healing and restoration of God's purposes in creation.
I want to say amen to that. And I want to enact to some extent what you've just been talking about. And we've got about 6 minutes before we finish. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to, in a very sort of, I know in a sound bite, but something that you might want to just just put out there so it becomes part of something that people can take away, think about, and maybe become part of their stories and their conversations. So I'm going to start with Bishop Saju on my screen. Is there something that you want to share in 30 seconds? You know, we're trying not to talk about time, but yeah.
Just inspired by what Lusa just said there. I think, Sharon, I think every one of us on this call, I think, has a story. But sometimes it takes time to know the story. And perhaps even this week, we can ask someone the question, what is your story? Which becomes the conduit to be able to share the gospel story. But do it over food, I suggest, over the conduit of hospitality, because something magical happens when you ask the question, what's your story? Especially with a cup of tea.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask Jessie next, then Richard. So Jessie, anything that comes to mind?
Thank you. Something that I'd share is that intentionality is very important. So we have to be intentional when we're thinking about intercultural church, because this doesn't come naturally to most of us. And even the life that we live, we're always drawn to people who are like, at least this is for me, who are like us or who have similar experiences to us. So there's an intentionality of what we are doing in building intercultural worshiping communities, but also intentionality of living this intercultural lifestyle, which goes beyond, for example, just going on holiday, but actually what can we learn from when we do go on holiday and bring that back into our everyday lives.
Thank you, Jessie. Richard and then Anjali.
Yeah, so thinking of, if you like, that picture of Sunday morning worship, and again, it may not be Sunday morning if we're doing this interculturally. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher that no one can understand, said all cultures are language games. And so we're telling a particular story about what the gospel looks like if our Sunday morning service is led by white men and we're in a mixed cultural neighborhood. The gospel story is of people of all ethnicities, all genders coming around the throne of Christ, that vision in Revelation. So what's our Sunday telling us about what the gospel is? That's a real good challenge for all of us.
Yes. Thank you, Richard. Anjali?
So, leading on from what both Jessie and Richard have said, I would say the journey can be long, it can be hard, but begin by intentionally making space for otherness in your worship. There are myriad ways you can do it, from the simplest of having pictures of different people to music to allowing different voices. But there needs to be that intentionality and there needs to be that space made.
Thank you so much. Bishop Lusa and then Bishop Martyn.
I love the image in some of our traditions when we gather around the Eucharist as the priest holds the broken host. She's given the opportunity to have an aperture into the reality of a world that is broken, that is fractured. But as she holds those hosts, she's also the privileged witness of a world that is called to wholeness and reconciliation in Jesus. And my sense is that being church is being a community gathered around Christ who invites us, but we are also being called to be attentive to what people come to church from and what they go back to from church. And for me, the intercultural community is one that is not just interested about what happens on a Sunday morning or a Saturday morning when we gather, but that is committed to transformation of every aspect of life.
Great, thank you so much. And Bishop Martyn, can I invite you to have
Thank you, Sharon. Although I don't think I should have the last word, so I'm very keen to hear from you, Sharon, as well as to your final thoughts on all of this. But let me just say, I'm going to be bold enough to say, I think this is the future of the church in England. And I'm not just talking about the Church of England, I'm talking about the church in England. One thing we've not had a chance to really talk about much this evening is the changes in the global church and how the center of gravity in the global church has shifted enormously. And yeah, the diversity within our society is only going to increase. And therefore, it seems to me that one of the primary tasks facing the church in England at this moment in time is whether we are open to increasing diversity within our churches. And that means an intentional process of reflecting on the interaction between people of different cultures. So I think we've only just begun this journey. I think there's a very long way to go yet. But for me, I am excited by that journey. It's a journey that I want to be a part of because, yeah, I have so much to learn about it. So my thanks to everyone who's engaged with this today.
And I want to kind of add to that and give my thanks too. This is a conversation that will continue. And as we become much more open and honest and willing to move beyond the superficial, it's not just about what we can, our artifacts. It is about living a life that convicts and convinces people this is how we have always been shaped to be by God. Our intercultural ways of being is about interdependence as far as I'm concerned. And I want to thank our panelists for their wisdom and their willingness to engage in this. And I hope this is the first of many books, as well as many ways to tell stories and to engage together. I just want to remind everybody that you can purchase the book at a discount. But also, if you feel inspired as well to talk more about this, please do get in touch. And there are a number of fora around to have this conversation, not just locally, but globally as well, because this is a real move of the spirit. And I just want to thank you all again. So with that, we say goodbye. So take care and thank you all.